Support for your public radio station comes from our members and from United Way of Greater Rochester and the Finger Lakes, serving the community for more than 100 years. Dedicated to creating a future where everyone's basic needs are met so all can thrive. More at unitedwayrocflx.org.
From WXXI News, this is Connections. I'm Evan Dawson. Our connection this hour was made on May 22nd when the United States House of Representatives passed a budget bill by one vote. The bill is known as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. It is President Donald Trump's budget agenda largely, and Senate Majority Leader John Thune has said that the Senate aims to pass it by the 4th of July. This big bill does a lot. It will knock some Americans off Medicaid and food stamps. It would kick nearly 11 million Americans off their health insurance. It will raise the debt by trillions of dollars. It will extend certain tax cuts. It will offer more defense spending. That is just for starters. A number of Republicans and in the U.S. Senate have been critical of parts of the bill. Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri has said that no American should lose their Medicaid thanks to this budget. Other Republicans, including former Doge head Elon Musk, have called the bill a fiscal disaster. Musk even used the word abomination. And Musk now is out of the government, as you know. We have a chance this hour to sit down with a member of Congress to discuss what is in the bill, what is not, and how things are going in Washington and the world. Congressman Joe Morelle, serving the 25th District, is back with us. Mr. Congressman, thank you for making time for the program.
Thanks. Great to be here.
We're going to spend much of the hour on the budget bill. But first, we just spent an hour talking about the different ideas out there about Israel and Iran. President Trump has said that Iran's leadership might need to surrender, that he might decide to take them out, but he's going to take another 2 weeks to decide if the United States should offer more military support for Israel. Do you think the United States should join with Israel in their war against Iran?
Well, I don't think there's enough evidence to support U.S. involvement. Look, Iran is a very large nation. It has 90 million people. It has an accomplished military. They have something like 3,000 ICBMs. This is a very, very, very big enterprise. And look, they're also responsible for all the terrorism in the region. I mean, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah or the Houthis or the Syrian government, which is no longer in existence, haven't been overthrown. But they have basically for decades sponsored terrorism. We do not want, and they cannot become a nuclear power. And we're going to continue to support efforts to try to make sure that doesn't happen. But they're also in a pretty weak position in many regards, facing international sanctions, financial challenges, military challenges. And this might be the opportunity that we've had to actually leverage through diplomacy some real changes in the region. First, to make sure that they don't develop a bomb, that whatever enrichment of uranium is reactor grade and nothing beyond, and have international inspectors come to observe that, to ensure that. It's also an opportunity for us to use our leadership in building an international coalition which could allow for a two-state solution in the Middle East and allow the Palestinians self-government and allow them to to have the homeland that they deserve, and so use that leverage with Prime Minister Netanyahu to make that happen. There's a lot that could happen here.
Do you trust this administration to accomplish that?
No, sadly, I think President Trump is truly out of his depth in this area. He has no sense of history, no sense of multilateral negotiations. I mean, even to listen to him say, I might do it, I might not, no one knows, and I'll tell you the moment before it happens, as though this were, we just chatted about this earlier, like he's playing, a role on The Apprentice. This isn't about him. It involves millions of people. It involves international stability in the region. I think he has no appreciation for it. And frankly, I think he's largely incompetent. And bullies are also cowards. And I don't think he is willing to invest the time or energy necessary. And frankly, he's got around him now just people who will agree. He is just complete yes people. I mean, he has so little confidence that he will not bring people into the government who might have an alternative perspective, who might give him, a little pushback. And I also think there's no theory of this. It's hard to reconcile the way he treats President Zelensky with the way he treats Prime Minister Netanyahu. I mean, these are two democracies. These are two allies, and yet he treats them completely differently. So he has no dedication to democracy, no commitment to self-governance, no commitment to helping friends and allies in the region. It's just for him, how does he personally feel about someone and whether they've insulted him or whether they've, in some way not done what he's wanted them to do. So he's not a serious person, and obviously that has grave consequences for us.
Well, as you know, the main nuclear enrichment facility at Fordo
Right.
is underground. It's not clear exactly how deep underground, but the New York Times had a really interesting infographic in their edition today that details what it would take to get into there. And you couldn't do it with one bomb. Israel doesn't have what you would call a bunker buster bomb. The United States does. We have 30,000-pound bombs and the aircraft needed to fly them.
Right.
So Israel couldn't attack that facility and get deep in there without us.
Right.
Should we allow them to use our equipment to go after that facility?
No, that's what I'm saying. I think this is an opportunity. I think and of course I'm not directly involved in it, but it appears the Iranian government has reached out to third parties to begin some sort of negotiation. Now, I don't know what that is. I don't know whether they're ever going to let international inspectors. They need to. That would help ensure people that they're not building a weapon. But there's a lot of opportunity here, and that's my point, is if you're really sort of deft at statesmanship and statecraft, you could start to figure out how do we leverage their weakness and the exposure that they have right now with creating a greater, more stable future for the people throughout that region. And that's what I would endeavor to do. I would use proxies who can speak to them and clearly they recognize the kind of military and lethal weaponry that we have. And to your point, no one knows for sure. There's estimates it's 500,000 or half a mile down underground. We probably do, but we would not be able to do it without significant loss of life. And frankly, a direct attack on a country who has not attacked us is, I don't want to say it's unprecedented, but it is wholly out of character for the United States government. So I would caution him, think about where you are, think about the resources we have, think about where we want to have this go, not just tomorrow, but where is it we want to be in a year, 5 years from now, and leverage our position vis-a-vis what's going on in that region right now and what we can do in the international community to pull people together. Now, it would be better if we were on better terms with our NATO allies and other international partners, if we hadn't insulted half the democratic community in the world. We would be in better position. But I still think we have an opportunity here to leverage this situation and make it better for Israel, for Palestine, for America, and for the international community.
So,
perhaps even better for Iran. I don't know, and that's not my concern immediately. But it is making sure that they stop state-sponsored terrorism throughout the region as well.
Well, and I want to ask you if you can offer a little bit of clarity, knowing that no one knows exactly what's going on in Fordo or how far along or what they're doing. But 3 months ago, Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, testifies to Congress and says, our conclusion is U.S. spy agencies don't think they're working on a nuclear bomb. Well, Donald Trump gets asked about that this week, and he basically blows it off and says she didn't know what she was talking about. She was wrong, and that President Trump agrees with Netanyahu's assessment that Iran is getting closer. And meanwhile, Tulsi Gabbard comes out this week and says, well, that was the media's causing confusion, blaming the media. But she did testify to Congress 3 months ago that U.S. spy agencies didn't think that they were working on a bomb. Best you know, best you understand, what do you think is going on?
Well, look, I think we have tended to disregard on our side of the aisle whatever Tulsi Gabbard says. We recognize that she has had a difficulty with facts in the past and with the truth. She tried to urge people to cozy up to Assad and the regime in Syria, and then tried to suggest that she didn't, even though she did. So when she said it, I'm not sure people took her at her word anyway, or feel as though she's either being truthful or that she necessarily even knows what she's talking about. That's sad to say about the person who heads national intelligence. But even the president said it. I mean, he essentially said the other day, I don't care what she said, she's wrong. It was kind of, I'm paraphrasing,
do you think
but
it's
essentially,
possible that Iran is not working on a nuclear weapon?
No.
You don't.
I think no, they're because they've clearly got enriched uranium far beyond what they need to use for commercial purposes for the development of electricity. Right, the amount of enrichment is a much lower grade to have nuclear reactors, and they have enriched uranium far beyond what they would need for reactor purposes for building energy. So I don't think anyone's believed it. I do think, and this is one of those odd twists, the supreme leader has, for religious purposes, prohibited the use of nuclear weapons within Iran. But I think people have said, well, he says that, but the scientists are working on it. They're building facilities. And, it's always a couple things. You have to be able to build the bomb, and then you have to be able to deliver the bomb. So there are many parts to it. But I think most serious people have believed that they have been working towards the development of nuclear weapons. And we do not want Iran. We don't want anyone who isn't already a nuclear power to become a nuclear power. I mean, we've seen the instability that North Korea can bring. I don't think, frankly, I don't think it's in the interest of China to have more nuclear players on the global map. So I think everyone has assumed they're doing it. People know that the supreme leader has said they cannot do it, but believe it's happening with or without him. I'm sure he has full knowledge that it's happening. So I have no doubt about that. The question is, have they gotten there? And I think it's within months, perhaps, not much longer than that they'd be able to deliver nuclear warheads, which is why this is partly coming to a head now. And I think Israel has made the determination that they're too close for comfort, and having essentially dramatically weakened Hamas, Hezbollah, after the pager incidents, has literally and figuratively been decapitated in terms of their leadership and their military posture. The Syrian regime has been overthrown. The Houthis are out there, but they're, I don't want to say they're on the periphery, but in terms of this, they're a smaller player as much as they've disrupted shipping in the region. But that's why, in many ways, you don't want them to become a nuclear power. You have a fair amount of leverage at this point because they are certainly wounded, and they recognize the inherent threats here of potential even for regime change. And you've got to get Netanyahu to appreciate and give voice to the idea that the Palestinians deserve a homeland. I know those sometimes feel like they're different things, but they're all connected in that space.
So a couple more quick ones here, and then we're going to move to the budget here. When it comes to drawing that red line here, you've said that really Iran can't get a nuclear weapon.
Right.
You're committed to that.
Correct.
You were not in Congress 23 years ago.
Correct.
You were serving at the state level at that point, I think.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, certainly.
What is time anyway, Mr. Congressman? Right. But for the Americans who feel some deja vu, they remember Colin Powell saying WMD in Iraq, that we need to engage with regime change, that this country for the last 100 years doesn't have a great record of supporting regime change that has good effects into the future. And then they see Iran, which is a huge country, very diverse and very...
I'm going to send an email to Ted Cruz to tell him there's 90 million people that live in Iran.
I'm sure he'll appreciate
he didn't
that.
know that.
I'm sure he'll appreciate that. That was part of the interview. I thought those are important questions. Do you understand the country if you're going to decapitate its leadership, right?
Well, and I'm not talking, and by the way, I'm not suggesting we go in.
I'm not saying you are.
Yeah,
What I want to know from you is, are you concerned that our involvement, if we're dropping bunker busters eventually to go after Fordo, could this lead to the kind of conflagration that leads to regime change, a collapsed government, a failed state, and are we ready for that? Are you worried about that?
I mean, I think I'm worried about anything that adds greater instability in the region, which poses greater harms to people everywhere there. And I think there are opportunities here because I don't think threatening the Iranians or mocking them or doing any of what the president does because he has no more maturity than a 6-year-old in a sandbox, that's not helpful. There's no way that can be helpful. And the words that he utters and the things that he posts, it's really striking to even consider that this is the leader, so-called leader, I put that in quotes, of the free world. But this is a moment. There is a moment where they obviously recognize how weakened they've become. And in my mind, you could do that. And look, make them, if they want to make the argument we're not building nuclear weapons, then I think the question is, okay, then put that to international inspection. It's happened in other places. This is not brand new. to go down inside their facility and to validate that. So it's essentially calling them on the question and also offering, because the president was prepared to do this. I mean, the so-called negotiations were about lifting sanctions, and they were about allowing them greater freedom in the international space. I think it's a question of, can we begin to do this? I'm not saying I would trust them, but there are ways to verify what they make commitments to. So I would hope we're a long way from using our technology and our lethal powers here without exhausting every opportunity to try to have some negotiated settlement that works for Israel, works for the Palestinians, works for the American interests, most importantly. And what I really worry about is an Iranian attack that kills Americans, because then the Americans' opinions will change dramatically. We've seen it, whether it was World War II, obviously.
We have 40,000 Americans over there, right?
And we have Americans all over the world stationed.
Yeah.
So we have military facilities all over the world. So any strike anywhere on Americans is going to change public opinion. So that's why the president shouldn't fool around with this. Do in the moment when you have these opportunities, and I think there are opportunities, make the most of it when you can. Don't wait for the situation to get worse. So I would use every tool of diplomacy at my disposal before I, even consider military intervention.
And wrapping up on that part of the world, you mentioned that there's a lot that is interconnected, whether people see it that way or not. You mentioned Palestine, and in December, in a 179-page report, Human Rights Watch concluded that Israel is depriving water to Palestinians in Gaza. They called it one of the 5 acts of genocide under the Genocide Convention. They said that Israeli authorities have intentionally inflicted on Palestinians in Gaza conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Doctors Without Borders and Amnesty International also concluded Israel's actions in Gaza constitute genocide. Do you see it that way?
No. Look, I as I explain often to people, I am not a fan of Benjamin Netanyahu, but I am a fan of Israel. I'm a supporter of Israel and their right to exist and defend themselves. And following October 7th, I think, and the slaughter of innocent people, their desire to wipe out Hamas to the degree they can is a reasonable, although obviously a tragic result of what's happened. And look, I voted against aid to Israel when it didn't include humanitarian aid in Gaza, and continue to believe we have to do everything we can, the United States, the international community, to make sure aid is given, and the Israelis are continually pressed on this question. But I do not think it's genocide, and I mean, this isn't what I think the Israelis want to do. I think they're, dealing with decades of anti-Semitism. They're dealing with the trauma still of World War II, when they have parents and grandparents who were subjected to the evils of Nazism. So I appreciate the great challenges facing the Jews around the world. And look, this is tragic. There's no question, and there's no other way to define it, but I would never describe this as genocide.
Well, what should happen there then? Because you've got something like a 50-to-1 ratio. On October 7th, 1,300 people were slaughtered by Hamas. Well, now you've got more than maybe 50,000 Palestinians. I mean, it boggles the mind. What should happen now?
Well, that's why I think in this moment there's real opportunity, because Iran is behind Hamas, Iran is behind Hezbollah, Iran is behind the Syrian regime and prop them up, and behind the Houthis. That's why in this moment, even though it seems farther away than you'd think, that trying to negotiate all this. But what should happen is there needs to be an agreement between the Palestinians and Israel about a homeland, about self-determination. I think they have to continue to be on guard against Hamas and terrorists. But I also think building and using the international coalition which exists, which is Egypt and Jordan and UAE and the Saudis and Americans, making sure we can create an environment where a two-state solution makes sense. Netanyahu is a problem in this regard. He continues to ignore any notion of a two-state solution, but it's not possible to move forward without that. He needs to state that they have a right to exist just in the same way that Israel does.
But it's
And,
not just
yeah.
Netanyahu. It's people like Smotrich and
No, no,
Ben-Gvir
it's
who
the
are maybe
coalition.
even more
Yeah.
virulent in their feelings toward Palestinians who are in leadership there.
Right. And there's no question. But the reality is, if you want American help and international coalitions' help here to deal with the threat of a nuclear Iran, here is an opportunity to, I think, have all sides recognize that there is more to be gained by a stable Middle East than there is by constantly exposing. And look, there's Israelis who are under threat because missiles from Iran, clearly, as we've seen in the last several days, can hit Israel and do. So I think there's a space. I don't speak for the Israeli government. I don't even speak for the American government. I speak as a representative in one of the houses. I think there is a moment here that if we're careful and we're thoughtful, and if we communicate with people in a respectful manner, I'm not sure that the president has the ability to do any of that, honestly, that there is really an opportunity here to do something that could be long-lasting and create stability in the region for everyone.
But you're not looking at Gaza saying, what we see there, no more aid to Israel until that stops.
I would not say that.
Okay, talking to Congressman Joe Morelle, let's shift to a conversation about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the OBBBA. And before I get into the specific questions about what's in this bill and what's not and how it's going to affect people's lives, what are some of the headlines to you about this?
So I think
You voted against it, by the way.
I did vote against it.
Passed by one vote in the House?
2015.
Or 215?
250, yeah, 2000, I wish. 215, 214. One member voted present, which is, think about this. This is one of the most significant pieces of legislation to be considered in the last, several decades. And it is the largest shift of resources from poor Americans to wealthy Americans in American history. To somehow not be able to make a decision about it and vote present, which is I'm here. I'm not voting yes. I'm not voting no. I don't know how you explain that. But in any case, this is really pretty simple. For all of the nuance and all the detail, this is pretty simple. The President of the United States and his party have determined that the wealthiest 5% of Americans, wealthiest 1% of Americans, however you calculate the benefits, will go to $4 to $5 trillion in tax breaks to the wealthiest Americans. And they can't do it entirely by cutting spending, but they're going to cut $2 trillion in basic services in terms of health care and nutrition assistance. But since they can't pay for all of that tax break with just cutting domestically and pass it, they have to then go borrow another $2.5, $3.5, $4.5 trillion to give tax breaks to wealthy Americans. That's the headline. That's the whole story here. How do we give our friends, who, by the way, contribute enormous amounts of money to our campaigns, how do we get them money? We take away from poor people, and then we borrow money that every American will have to participate in paying back. It is irresponsible. It is reprehensible. It is amoral, and it is un-American.
I've tried to pull as much as I can factually about this bill just from nonpartisan sources, the Congressional Budget Office and more. So this bill would extend the major provisions of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which would have expired at the end of 2025, right?
Many of the provisions, yes. Some were made permanent, like the corporate tax rates were permanent, but other provisions, because reconciliation, which is how we're doing this without boring your listeners completely.
No, but this matters.
Yeah, but the reconciliation, if you don't make the law permanent, under reconciliation, your temporary measures, like some of these tax cuts, can only last for 10 years, and then they either go away. So, for instance, the deductibility of state and local taxes, which has now been constrained, you can deduct up to only $10,000. So that went into effect, but it goes away, and we go back to the original deductibility with no limitations if this doesn't become law. So that was one of the temporary ones. We're at the 10-year mark of the 2017 bill.
Well, you've got John Thune in the Senate saying we're going to try to pass this by the 4th of July. You have Senator Josh Hawley saying we can't do Medicaid cuts. I mean, how much is going to change, do you think, before we see a final bill here?
I think Josh Hawley has done a good job of articulating the problem. I also have no faith that Josh Hawley isn't going to fold like a deck of cards. I mean, he'll do whatever the president says. And this is what they're doing. It is fascinating to watch this because every independent poll has showed that this proposal is underwater with the American public, sometimes as much as 20%. So 20% favorability, 40% unfavorable, and the rest apparently don't have an opinion about it yet. But so what they've begun to do is just lie about the bill. And they'll say, well, we're not throwing anybody off of Medicaid. But what they're effectively doing is creating so many burdens and barriers and paperwork requirements that the net effect, according to the Congressional Budget Office, which is nonpartisan, is that 15 million Americans will no longer have health insurance who have it now. But they'll tell you to your face, oh, we're just taking people off who are abusing the system.
Yeah, waste, fraud, and abuse.
Yeah, which, by the way, when you're a Medicaid recipient, unless you're lying about your income, which is verifiable through the tax code because you have to file tax returns, the people who receive Medicaid dollars aren't the people on Medicaid. It's the providers. So you go to a doctor if you're on Medicaid. The doctor gets paid by Medicaid. You don't get paid as the patient. You simply get the service. So for all of that, what they want to do is tell you that people who qualified before who will no longer qualify, those 15 million Americans, that was all waste, fraud, and abuse, when it's actually we have increased the regulatory burden so much that 15 million people no longer are able to comply. And think of the irony of this. We're cutting back dramatically on regulations on polluters, but we're increasing the regulation and burden on poor people who get health insurance through the Medicaid program.
Who, by the way, vote in all different directions, including for this administration?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, there's a pretty significant percentage of Americans who don't have an opinion about this, I think, who haven't followed this and don't know. The problem is this is a little bit like a tsunami. By the time it hits you, it's too late to stop it. And I think people in rural communities are going to be the ones most harmed. This also is basically trying to repeal part of the Affordable Care Act, which they tried repeatedly to do, couldn't do it because it's more popular than they think. So they're going to backdoor it by making changes. So if you fail, and you're on Medicaid now, if you fail to be on Medicaid, they're also going to bar you from being able to buy a policy on the exchange under the Affordable Care Act.
You mentioned this bill scales back many of the Inflation Reduction Act's clean energy tax credits.
Yeah.
How significant?
I mean, it's very significant. I mean, this is an administration that refuses to believe in climate change, refuses to recognize the damage it's already doing, which is why they're attacking FEMA, and who knows what that's going to be like when we have natural disasters that come along and FEMA isn't there to be able to protect people. But all the work that's gone, and by the way, a lot of the clean energy projects were aided by government support and subsidies, but a lot of private capital went into these projects. A lot of people did things. A lot of farmers in the agricultural space invested money on the promise that they were going to get reimbursed, and now they're out of money. This is breaking commitments to people, and it's going to make us a less safe planet when it comes to, the climate crisis.
SNAP cuts, food stamps, essentially?
Yeah, I think about $300 billion in cuts to nutrition assistance, whether it's the WIC program, which stands for Women, Infants, and Children. It is devastating. And again, the fascinating thing about this is a lot of those programs benefit American farmers, many of whom live in rural communities, have little income, are struggling, and this makes it so much harder. And they haven't quite, I think, caught up to the idea that their president did this to them. But they will in time. I'm convinced of that. They're clearly going to recognize the impact that all this has on them.
Regarding debt, after all this talk about DOGE and balancing a budget and being responsible, this bill was going to add several trillion dollars to the federal debt?
Yeah, it's really astonishing. I talked to a lot of people who supported DOGE, who say, thank God Elon Musk is in there cutting the cost of government. And I have two things to say about it. One, doing this the way they did it is completely it's not even intelligent. I mean, there are a lot of things you could do to make government more efficient and cut costs. I would welcome that. Bill Clinton made it a big part of his administration, and Al Gore led that effort. There's things that we could and should do. So it's not, but it's the manner in which they did, which is basically firing people, cutting services without even knowing what those people did or what those services were. But the interesting thing about it is that happened in a way that's scary. But the unfortunate thing is, I think a lot of people who are supporting that thought to themselves, well, if the government spends $1 billion less, that means my taxes are going to go down by $1 billion. Little did they know that the money being saved, and I put saved in quotes, but the money being saved isn't being returned to the American taxpayer. It's going to the wealthiest Americans. And oh, by the way, it's also going to cost you more because we're going to increase the debt now by $3, $4, $5 trillion, depending on economic conditions as we move forward.
On taxes, what about the child tax credit, though? Would increase the child tax credit to $2,500 through 2028, $2,000 after that? What do you think?
Well, it's $2,000 now, so they're going to raise it. This is one of those things. Permanent cuts in corporate taxes, permanent cuts and reductions in personal income at the highest income levels, and we'll give you, as a throwaway, we'll increase the child tax credit by a few $100s for a few years, and then it's gone.
So you don't think it's a sincere effort to help families?
Oh, no, it's clearly not. It's actually worse than that. It's insincere because if you really want to cut child poverty in the United States, as we did during the pandemic, we increased dramatically the child tax credit, and that would help average families who are struggling with the extraordinary costs of daycare, and so that would be a way to really be a game changer.
Isn't there room for some? I mean, J.D. Vance campaigned on a stronger child tax credit. They are a lot of Republicans call themselves pronatalists. They want bigger families. Isn't there room for compromise here?
Well, there would be if there was leverage. If they were interested in talking to us, there's a world of difference that could be made in this legislation. But to the point you made at the beginning, which is the vote was 215 to 214 to 1. You can't have a smaller margin for victory. And they could have gotten 300 votes for a package that met needs of people that we care about and the people that they care about. We could have clearly done that.
What about no tax on tips? What do you think about that?
You know, I struggle with it. I certainly understand people at the lower end of the income scale in terms of jobs need tax relief. What I struggle with is sort of the logic here. If you're a landscaper and you're out making minimum wage and working in the hot sun, why is the income that you make taxed at a higher percentage than someone else who's doing hard work but is in a job that tips are typically part of the makeup of that income? So no one has been able to describe for me why Donald Trump wants this other than Nevada is a big tip state because of Las Vegas, and he wanted to win Nevada in the Electoral College. I mean, that's the promise he made. But I struggle with the logic of it. Can you describe a logic for picking certain kinds of work and taxing at a different rate?
Well, I mean, Vice President Harris jumped right on board with that proposal after Donald Trump rolled it out last year. It was very popular.
Which doesn't make it right.
Okay. I'm just saying I think it's very politically popular right now.
Yeah, it is politically popular. But, again, if you're if you work in a daycare center and you make minimum wage or a little above minimum wage, how do you not say now, it might be better to go work in a restaurant because I at least can earn tips and some of that's going to be tax-free. It's just that I think we should be cutting taxes for everyone on the lower income scale. We should be raising the minimum wage. The federal government is $7.25 an hour. Can you imagine that? The federal minimum wage. If Donald Trump cared about people at the lower end of the income scale, especially when we have fewer workers than we need more workers, wouldn't you just say, well, the way to do this, let's increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour. We'll double it from what it is. No, we're not going to do that. He's looking at it from a purely political point of view. And again, I'm completely sympathetic. We want people to have more discretionary income. I just wonder how two people working side by side, if you work in a hotel and you're changing bed sheets and you're breaking your back, I think tips in hotels are probably much lower than they used to be. But you're taxed at a different rate, and I'm just struggling to understand the logic of it. I get that it's popular. The question is it fair? And also, what are going to be the unintended consequences as people move now? And frankly, it also gives opportunities, I think, to businesses that have tip workers. It gives them the opportunity to not raise wages because they say, well, look, you get a lot in tips, and none of those tips are taxed anymore. So, I just think I'm struggling to understand the logic of other than it's politically popular. I get that.
One other question on the budget bill, and then we'll take a break, and we'll welcome some of your feedback for Congressman Joe Morelli. There's some AI in this bill, provisions in this bill to ban state regulation of artificial intelligence. So this is not an area of expertise for me. It's just an area of fear. I'm a Luddite who's very worried. Dario Amodei is the head of one of the leading AI firms in the world, and he told Axios last week he has upgraded his estimation regarding the chances that AI will wipe out humanity. He now puts it at 20%. Axios followed up with an important question that I'm going to steal a lot on this program. If someone told you that an airplane had a 20% chance of crashing, would you fly in it? No way would you fly in it. Nobody would fly in it. But we're going to, and he's the head of these companies building this stuff, saying, we think we can control it. There's stuff we don't understand about what it's starting to do. There's stuff that is surprising us. But if we don't do it, someone will. And this bill seeks to block states from trying to regulate it individually. So where are you on AI? You worried about AI? Should there be more regulation of AI?
Yes, I involved in a lot of conversations in Washington around AI, and there's a number of groups that invited me to events to talk about artificial intelligence, partly because I've been one of the most vocal advocates on the use of generative AI in pornography and intimate images. I've been very active in ways of making sure that we're protected from AI when it comes to political campaigns and political advertisements. So I've been in this space. And I was at a dinner of the American Society of Artificial Intelligence just a couple of months ago. And one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle said, here's two things we need to do. We need to stop the states from doing separate regulations so that we don't have a patchwork of 50 different or more different standards around AI. And we need to make the courts make decisions on what the policies ought to be. And I said, respectfully, I understand the first. You don't want a patchwork of different standards. I think that would dramatically reduce the development of AI tools. But it is entirely inappropriate to suggest that the courts ought to make all the decisions we have to make around AI because you'll just have a different patchwork. It's really incumbent upon the United States Congress to take this seriously and to make sure that there are protections in place and working with industry to make sure we can develop the appropriate guardrails. So it involves privacy of data. It involves the use of data sets for training these large models to make sure that copyrighted material or copyrighted developers, whether it's songs or written material or visual works of art or photographs, all that is being used in data sets and it's copyrighted. And is anybody compensating those people? I mean, there are a ton of issues here. Not the least of which is how you ensure that the data being used isn't getting corrupted. So you have to curate data. There's a lot that goes on, and believe me, I'm not an expert on the development, but it's also not like traditional programming where people have this notion that you could go in and look at the code and say, oh, that's why I got an outcome because of the code.
Right.
That is not how this works.
No.
There are hundreds and hundreds of millions, billions in some cases even more, pieces of data that go in and switches that get set inside where it's weighting different, almost like synapses, and then it comes out with a decision after, as I said, hundreds of billions of calculations. You couldn't pinpoint how AI arrived at a particular, decision or a particular recommendation or a particular, and some of it's wrong. So you have to be very careful about parameters that you use when asking it to develop something. So there's a lot that goes in it. It is not, your father's programming anymore. This is a whole different thing, which is why it really takes some thoughtfulness around the development of public policy. And so I think the Republicans are wrong to suggest that the courts can do it and the Congress doesn't have the capability. We need to do this because you're right. I think there are places we could get into real trouble here if we're not careful.
I'm going to want to look back at my comments in this era and laugh. That's what I want to do because I think we should probably just stop the whole thing. But we can't. I understand it. I get it. I'm not unrealistic, and it's not about me. But also I think it's terrible. All right, let's take a short break. We're right back with Congressman Joe Morelle and some of your feedback for the congressman on the other side.
Support for your public radio station comes from our members and from Bob Johnson Auto Group, proud supporter of Connections with Evan Dawson. Believing an informed public makes for a stronger community. BobJohnsonAutoGroup.com.
This is Connections. I'm Evan Dawson. I think we have Katie in Rochester first. Hey, Katie, go ahead.
Hi, Congressman Morelli. Thank you so much for taking my question. My question today is, what is being done to rebuild public trust in the Democratic Party?
Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Go ahead.
Katie, I think you've asked, at least for Democrats, you've asked the, I don't know, it used to be called 64 and then $128,000 question. I don't know with inflation what it would be now, but it's the central question I think that Democrats are dealing with. And I think in part, I would say two things. One, people who are critical of the Democratic Party for not having a single voice, I think, miss the point of the Democratic Party. Will Rogers famously said, I'm not a member of an organized political party, I'm a Democrat. We're messier. We don't have single voices. We have many voices. I mean, we sort of like the idea of and it's part of our DNA to discuss and have many voices. We will coalesce around leadership in, whether it's the nominee of our party in 2028 or if it's the new speaker, hopefully in January of 2027. So leaders will emerge. But you asked about trust, and I think that's really important. I would say, particularly for the Democratic Party, because we're perceived as the party of government or believing that government can be a force for good. If we're going to be that party, we have to be really good about delivering results. And I think our results at times are mixed. And so if we're going to rebuild, we have to do a couple different things. We have to demonstrate we have a plan that elevates every single American, gives every American opportunity, but be thoughtful and sober about how we help to make that happen. We can't stick with the status quo because in many cases that fails people and they feel frustrated and they lost faith. I think the second thing that has happened is people believe that everyone who gets elected and goes to Washington, whether they were good when they started or not, that their self-dealing is just the culture and that they don't represent the interests of average Americans. And so we've got to demonstrate not only in terms of policy and the ability to deliver on those things we articulate when it comes to government's ability to touch people, but also we have to prove to people that we are going to make sure that their interests are put first and foremost. And I think there's a great opportunity to do that. We're going to, in the coming months, address abuses by the Trump administration around corruption. We're going to address the Supreme Court and the court's ethical lapses like Clarence Thomas. But we've also got to take to heart and do some things internally within Congress to stop the self-dealing. So that's going to mean campaign finance reform. It's going to be putting an end to stock trading by members of Congress. We've got to demonstrate a real commitment to this if the American people are going to trust us again. And we have to listen to people. I know it's hard. I mean, sometimes, and I think we're all probably guilty of this, is we get ideas in our head and we're committed to them, even maybe when evidence suggests maybe we ought to rethink it. And I think sometimes we get stuck and we lose the ability to listen to people and what they really want. So I hope that's what you meant by the question. I think those are the things that we need to do, and we need to do it with a sense of urgency.
Katie, thank you for the phone call. I think we have Jim. Is that you, Jim, in Rochester?
Yes.
Go ahead, Jim.
Okay. Let's see. I've got two index cards based on the.
Got to keep it tight, Jim. Go ahead.
Okay. First, I'll just start from where I started. The Carter administration inherited the Iran tragedy based on the Nixon administration regime change, putting the Shah back in power. Also, let's not forget the Iran-Contra scandal, where we traded arms and what have you so that they could fund the illegal operations of Contra when the Republican administration didn't like the Democrats pulling the strings, not wanting to follow that through. Moving along, Netanyahu, who is making the same pitch that was used by Bush for the Iran invasion based on weapons of mass destruction and trying to liberate the people from a bad regime. Netanyahu also kept Hamas in power by not supporting their Palestinian Democratic rival, which was on the other side. Moving along to the tax issues.
Jim, let me just jump in there only because we're going to run out of time. And I appreciate the call, but there's a lot there, and I'm going to let the congressman respond to what he's
Yeah, I think, Jim, I appreciate that. I think, look, we have to always be mindful our job is to protect American interests. I think American interests are furthered when there is democracy in the world and there's peace in the world. And we should not jump to the idea that there are weapons of mass destruction. And frankly, I don't think Iran's gotten there yet. But as I said, Iran needs to be cannot be a nuclear power. And that's why I think in this moment, diplomacy and conversations in the international community are the best way to put pressure on them, even to hold out the carrot that sanctions could be lifted under the right circumstances. And, I think we're a little ways away from that, but they are weakened. I think they recognize it. I think this is as open as they've been to conversation. And then there are ways to verify commitments that people make, and that's what I would insist on as we move forward.
But you're not ruling out the idea that, based on what could happen between Israel and Iran, that you would support Israel getting the support of the United States to go after Fordo to get more involved.
Well, look, I think that assumes a lot of hypotheticals that haven't proven out yet, and it depends on the circumstances. But my strong preference would be to use this moment, which I think is unique in the last several decades, to be able to have a conversation with the Iranians that I don't think has happened in the past. I don't think we should say we're going to destroy Iran without regard to hearing from them on whether they're willing to agree to not creating nuclear weapons. But let's say they were to say that tomorrow, that we will dispense with the development of nuclear weapons. We'll agree to inspectors. We would like the following things to happen. I think we ought to listen to that, and we ought to try to encourage that conversation.
George called in to ask, you wouldn't expect Israel to disarm itself. Why should we be able to demand that Iran disarm itself?
Well, look, I think Iran and Israel, that's not a parallel conversation. Iran has promoted terrorism in the region. They don't do it directly themselves many times, but they have clearly funded Hezbollah and Hamas and the Syrian regime and the Houthis, and they have used other actors in the region to promote terrorism and instability. They have committed to the destruction of Israel. They are committed to the destruction of the United States. I don't think making that, I think, is a false equivalency.
Okay, got a couple of emails about, just want your thoughts on ICE, including in one of the emails, concern about a House resolution that the listener says you voted for that expresses gratitude to ICE, a resolution condemning a horrific attack in Boulder, Colorado. Thoughts on that, Mr. Congressman?
Well, just generally speaking on ICE, really more importantly, it's immigration, and it's the way that the Trump administration and the Homeland Security Secretary and her administration have conducted affairs. I mean, this is horrific what we're seeing happen across the country. The president has now installed a quota of deportations per day, almost without regard to even caring whether people are here, quote unquote, legally, whether they are here and they are documented, whether they're here without any suspicion that they've done anything wrong. The violation of people in Venezuela and Guatemala and others where they had temporary protected status, which has been suddenly eliminated. The SIV program in Afghanistan with people who helped U.S. Forces in Afghanistan and were made commitments to them and their family that we have now revoked. I mean, this is a little bit like my great-grandparents coming from Italy, being here for 2 years, working, building a life, and then being told suddenly, oh, yeah, we changed the rules, you have to go back home. I mean, it's inhumane, it's immoral, it's un-American, it's reprehensible. And so I'm going to continue to speak out as I have. I mean, the last several months, I don't think I have been in any way unclear about how strongly I feel about this and how hard people have worked to come here. And honestly, most of the people who come here, they want a better life for themselves. But more importantly, I think they want a better life for their children. And that's, a story that's as old as America is. I know it'll be shocking to people. The Morelli family did not come on the Mayflower. And so immigration is one of the great things about American history. The resolution you talked about is a resolution which was passed in the House just about a week or so ago that condemned anti-Semitism and the awful, horrific attacks in Boulder, Colorado. It did have a paragraph that thanked law enforcement and ICE for keeping the homeland safe, I think was the way it is. And honestly, I struggled with it. I wanted to condemn anti-Semitism. I wanted to condemn the attacks. I would not have written it that way. The Republicans do this, I think, as a way to drive wedges between Democrats and force us to make uncomfortable decisions. And so we talked about it on staff. And, these are not easy questions where you just cavalierly make a decision. I felt in that moment speaking out about anti-Semitism and hate crimes was the most important thing in that resolution. So I voted for it. Obviously, people have different opinions about it, but I don't think I've tried to be clear about what I think about deportations, the way that immigrants are treated in this country, which I think is awful and horrific.
Diane in Rochester, will the budget bill affect programs like Child Health Plus in New York? Do we know?
Well, it will affect the state pretty dramatically, and I've talked to the governor and continue to talk to the governor and senior staff. I mean, until it passes, you won't know entirely the impact on the state budget. But just to remind people, Medicaid is a program which, for every dollar that gets spent for health care for a Medicaid recipient, 50 cents gets reimbursed by the state or is paid for by the state. The other 50 cents comes from the federal government, which is, by the way, the lowest reimbursement in the country. Mississippi gets almost 77% of every dollar spent in Mississippi on Medicaid gets paid by the federal government. So New York is treated as badly as anyone with the lowest reimbursement in the country, something we've continued to fight against. But this is going to put a huge hole in the budget of the state of New York. And so we'll be working to try to protect all these programs. I hope we'll be able to protect Child Health Plus and other programs for children. But I think it remains to be seen.
And we're literally going to hear the music. So 20 seconds, which is unfair. A listener wanted to know if you thought what happened in L.A. was provoked by the Trump administration and if we're going to see more military in the streets.
Well, I hope the answer to the second is no, but I don't trust the president not to put more military. He's doing this as a pretext, I think, to create martial law in places, and he does this all for politics, and it was totally unwarranted. It was not necessary.
What happened in L.A., unwarranted?
Unwarranted, not necessary to deploy troops. The people in Los Angeles and California could have handled this, would have handled this, and should have handled this.
Thank you for making time for the program. We always appreciate that. Thank you very much. That's
bet.
Congressman Joe Morelle taking our calls, taking your calls, taking our questions. And it's been a very busy week from all of us. Thank you for listening to your member-supported public media. From the whole team here, we'll be back with you next week. Thanks.
This program is a production of WXXI Public Radio. The views expressed do not necessarily represent those of this station, its staff, management, or underwriters. The broadcast is meant for the private use of our audience. Any rebroadcast or use in another medium without expressed written consent of WXXI is strictly prohibited. Connections with Evan Dawson is available as a podcast. Just click on the Connections link at WXXInews.org.